Hey, everybody. I'm over here, right? How's everybody doing? Okay, we are going to talk about the secret sauce that protects us from tyranny, the U.S. Constitution. And we have who I believe to be one of the smartest guys in the United States on this subject, Senator Mike Lee from Utah. Give it up for Mike Lee.
It's sort of like being one of the tallest buildings in Tooele, Utah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the first question. That it seems to me that most Americans don't know anything about our founding's business plan. Why don't we know about the Constitution anymore?
You know, it's something that people feel like they have the luxury of not worrying about during times of prosperity and during periods in which we're not subject to extreme, obvious oppression. In addition to this, I think that there are people in our government and people in our education system who are all too content with not reminding people that the whole point of having a constitution is to limit government power. That's the whole thing. That's its entire purpose. In fact, with the sole exception of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and therefore directly affects individual conduct, every other provision of the Constitution is there to restrict government power. And progressives throughout our society today, especially those in the news and entertainment media industry and in many parts of our education system, don't really like talking about limitations on government because they've never met a government program they don't like, or at least they don't like the idea of any suggestion that government action is sometimes bad.
So you are unique because you are a politician who actually has read the Constitution. And it would be, in typical times, I would not ever look to a politician to understand anything about the Constitution, let alone defending it. But you had a unique childhood where the Constitution was discussed at the dinner table.
Yep.
How is that possible?
First of all, every family does that.
Do we all do this?
Every family should. I think I was 30 before I realized not every family did that. But yeah, we talked about the Constitution around the dinner table when I was a kid. My late father was a lawyer and was a professor of constitutional law. He served as President Reagan's first Solicitor General. And so he talked to us about these things. And my mother was an educator. And so they were good at breaking those things down so that we could understand them. And I think that sort of conversation used to be a lot more common in America. And it also used to be a lot more common in our schools. We've lost some of that. But the great thing about the Constitution is that it's not an angry, jealous mistress or anything. It doesn't mind that you haven't read it before or that you haven't looked at it in a while. You can pick it up today, we're talking about roughly 5,000 words. It's written in language that is still easy to understand today. And the more of us there are who read it, the more of us there will be who understand it, especially if we then start talking to our friends and our coworkers and our family members, even our crazy uncles at Thanksgiving. That helps. Every little bit helps.
So you are not just a guy that's read the Constitution. You actually have some credentials here. You're a constitutional lawyer, and you clerked for Judge Alito. Give us your bona fides so we know you're not just making this up.
So I'm a lawyer. My expertise was in appellate litigation, and being an appellate litigator, I handled a lot of cases that involved issues of law, including issues of constitutional law. I served as a law clerk right out of law school to a federal district judge in Utah named Judge D. Benson. Then I clerked for Justice Alito twice. First when he was on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in New Jersey, and then a second time after he got himself put on the Supreme Court. And that's kind of where I got my start professionally and also deepened my interest in constitutional law.
And then you lost your way and became a politician.
Yes, but ironically, it was because of my interest in the Constitution that I became a politician. I don't view myself as a politician who used to be a lawyer. I'm rather a lawyer and a lifelong student of the Constitution who's currently serving in the United States Senate, and that's why I'm there. I'm there because as a lawyer, I got tired of looking at what was happening in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives with members of my own political party who were voting quite frequently to expand the size, scope, reach, and cost of the federal government without so much of a whimper about where their authority in the Constitution could be found. Most of the time, they didn't have any, and that bothered me.
So some people may not know this story. I know because I was involved in the Tea Party movement back in the day when you got so frustrated that you decided to take on a Republican incumbent senator in the state of Utah, but you did it in a way that no one's ever done it before. You rented a camper or a van or something, and you traveled the state of Utah, and you gave rallies or talks about the Constitution. Who does that?
It's how every good campaign starts, with speeches about federalism and separation of powers, textualism and originalism. But it is how we did it. And my brother-in-law had a big RV, and he got some signs that we put in the windows, and we drove around the state. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done, but we started getting crowds. People started realizing that the Constitution really is accessible to the people, and that it's been so neglected over time that it's time for some personnel changes to be made.
So we started talking maybe about a year ago about this problem with government education and the inability of young people, not the inability of young people, but the inability of that system to arm young people with the basic knowledge of the roadmap on how America works. And we've been trying for centuries to fix government education. I don't even want to consider trying to fix higher education right now, but we realize there's this thing called technology and YouTube and other ways that young people will sort of hack the system and go learn for themselves. And we came up with this idea to create a series, an ongoing series, and hopefully we get all the way through the entire Constitution, called The Constitution Line by Line, starring yours truly. Or yours truly. Yours truly. I don't know what you would say there, but
it's never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would be the star of a TV show, whether internet-based or otherwise. But I couldn't be more honored that you invited me to appear as the host and the focus of the Constitution Line by Line. It's a fantastic show. In it, we break down each provision of the Constitution, and we literally go through it line by line. We read the entire text of the provision we're talking about that day. Then we talk for a few minutes about why it matters and what some of the controversies that may have arisen around it might be. And our objective was to turn the Constitution into something that can be digested easily. You can't swallow an elephant, but you can eat it bite by bite over time. And you actually can read the Constitution in one setting, but this makes it easier to do it.
so you give us some context here, because you've written, I think, 4 books now, if memory serves right, and you have spent your career as an author trying to translate legal principles into common sense, plain English stories. And I'm thinking of 2 books in particular, Our Lost Constitution and Our Lost Declaration. And I think at one point you said to me, maybe I should have done it the other way around. Talk about the spirit of '76 and how that inspired the authors of this beautiful document.
So the Constitution is the frame that protects the picture of who we are as Americans. The picture itself is supplied by the Declaration of Independence. It was in that declaration that we identified human beings as having some eternal significance. There's a cosmic feature to this. We are eternal beings. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those rights are so self-evident and all-encompassing that they entitle us, and in some cases even oblige us, when we're beset by a government that has become destructive of those same ends, to overthrow whatever government that is besetting us, is depriving us of those same rights. And so the founders, when they signed the Declaration, were literally signing their own death sentence. It was treasonous to do what they did. But they did what they did, notwithstanding the fact that they were some of the people who had a lot to lose. They were going to be the easiest to find. They did it because they believed deeply in these principles. And so through those two books, Our Lost Declaration and Our Lost Constitution, I take some stories from our founding era and break them down in a way that helps to highlight and showcase the significance of these documents. My wife, Sharon, who's here with me this week over there, inspired me many years ago. She told me that, wave to everyone, Sharon. She told me people will listen more. She had been to how many thousands of my campaign rallies and my speeches about the Constitution. She said, I've noticed something. People listen when you talk about the Constitution in the form of a story. It was her polite way of saying you're boring people to tears sometimes. But it works better when you tell them in the form of a story. And so I make them more accessible through these books.
So, reading assignment for everybody here, Our Lost Constitution and Our Lost Declaration. These books are essential. And what's the one with the stories?
Written Out of History is another book where I talk about America's forgotten founding fathers and founding mothers. People who have been neglected, forgotten, or as I put it, written out of history because they don't fit the narrative of white male slave owners. Some of them were neither white nor male. Some of them were founding mothers, not founding fathers. But I tell the stories of people like Mum Bet, who was an African slave who litigated for and won her freedom in court after the Revolution in Massachusetts, based on a provision of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1783. And by so doing, she opened the door for millions of slaves in America to win their freedom. But we don't tell her story anymore. We need to revive it.
So let's pull a couple of stories from the episodes themselves. And it sort of makes some logical sense to start with Article 1, Section 1. And there's something in there about Congress and not the executive being in charge of writing laws.
Yeah. Look, it's no coincidence that in the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution, the first operative provision after the preamble, which all the preamble does is just sort of set the stage for explain why they were doing these things. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It's a significant phrase. It said legislative powers are the powers to make law. What they're saying is you may not make a federal law in this land without going through Congress. That's significant. It shouldn't be remarkable anymore, and yet it is, now more than ever, because we have so many of our laws measured by volume, weight, length, economic impact, anything, are passed not by elected lawmakers in the Congress, but by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats.
So let's dig a little bit deeper in that because you have tried to rein that in, no pun intended.
Pun taken.
Yeah, what's the project?
The project involves something called the REINS Act. It's an acronym, R-E-I-N-S, stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. This is a bill that's been run by my friend and colleague Rand Paul over the last 10 years. And if I had one single legislative bullet to fire to hit the target, it would be that one. The reason is it would require that all federal regulations that affect the rights of the American people, imposing affirmative legal obligations on you as a citizen that are economically significant in any way, they would have to be affirmatively enacted into law by a vote of Congress. Right now, they're able to take effect automatically. I'll tell you how it works. In a nutshell, we'll pass something that says, we shall have good law in area X. We hereby delegate to department or commission Y the power to make and enforce good laws in that area. We shall have clean air. We hereby give the EPA the power to decide what clean air is, what pollutants are, and decide who will get punished to what degree for exceeding pollution limits established by the EPA. That has resulted in the cleaning of America's air. The problem with it has not been the result. The problem with it has been the manner in which it's taken form, because they've completely circumvented the lawmaking organ of the federal government. And by so doing, they've taken the people out of the equation. They've tried to put experts, scientists in charge of it. This is the dream of the progressive movement, which is to remove the people, the unwashed masses as they see them, from the process of making their own laws, and instead install wise men and women who are experts, who have PhDs to do it for them, people who cannot be thrown out because they're beyond the political process. It's barbaric, it needs to end, and the REINS Act would restore the primacy of the legislative function.
So why on earth would members of Congress, it seems like there's some substantial egos on the Senate floor sometimes, present company accepted, of course. Why would you give up your power like that?
I talk about this a lot in our lost Constitution, and as I explain it there, this comes about as a result of a strong desire that elected officials have to claim that they're doing something good, to claim that they're helping the people. And so, first of all, what idiot's going to want to have his or her name posted on the headlines as, so-and-so votes against clean air? Nobody wants to be perceived as voting against clean air. It's like voting against grandmas or apple pie or cute puppies and kittens. Nobody wants to do that. So they vote for it. But then they keep voting for it, even though they're losing power as a result of it, because it gives them something that politicians love but never ever want to admit, which is plausible deniability. So when the EPA comes along and it, for example, decides to set ozone limits at a level below where Mother Nature has herself set them, it's a true story, this happened in parts of my state, resulting in it being very difficult to do business in some parts of the state because of the naturally occurring ozone levels. When stuff like that happens, then people complain to their lawmakers. The lawmakers will beat their chest and they'll say, those barbarians at EPA, I can't believe that. I'm going to send them a harshly worded letter, as if that were the job of the lawmaker, to send a harshly worded letter. But at the end of the day, they're avoiding accountability for laws that they themselves have passed. That's what's so tragic and so disgraceful about all of this. You see, James Madison anticipated that this wouldn't happen, that power would be made to counteract power, that the natural human interest within each branch of government would create these forces that would hold power in balance and make sure that this power wouldn't be transferred to the other branches. That changed when federal lawmakers no longer saw federal power as limited, and they wanted to attain lifetime perpetual incumbency in office. That's how we got to where we are. But this is not without consequence. I also tell a story in our Lost Constitution about this father and son team. Kerry Mills and O.C. Mills and his son Kerry, they were property developers. They were developing a piece of land in Florida's Escambia Bay for a small handful of residential buildings. They were clearing the land after they'd secured all the necessary permits, and they brought in some fill dirt, some sand, before digging the foundations. All of a sudden, they were approached by some officials from the government who had informed them that although none of their research had indicated as much, that these were in fact wetlands. They ended up being charged with polluting the waters of the United States in violation of the Clean Water Act. The pollution that they had introduced was clean sand that they introduced as fill. They both spent a couple of years in prison. As a result of federal regulations put in place by EPA, there was no malum in se, nothing inherently wrong about the thing in and of itself, nothing even visible to them, indicating that this would be unlawful. It was James Madison in Federalist 62 who wrote that it'll be of little avail to the American people that their laws be written by men of their own choosing, if those laws are so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that they can't be read and understood by those subject to them. Unfortunately, we're not only to that place, but our laws aren't even being written by men of our own choosing. That's got to stop.
So on my flight out to FreedomFest, I was flying United, but I think this probably happens on all airlines now. At least a dozen times throughout the flight, I was told that there was a federal law requiring me to wear a face mask, and if I didn't do that, the air marshal was going to tase me in the face. Do they say that on your airline? Because it's sort of disconcerting. But they go on and on about this is a federal law and it's punishable by all these sorts of federal crimes and all that stuff. But is it a law? And where in Article 1 do they mandate face masks on airplanes, I guess is my question.
They don't. And to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on what the definition of the word law is. If they mean a federal statute, is there a federal statute? Remember, all legislative powers existing in the federal government belong to Congress. And has Congress ever passed a law saying you must wear a face mask on an airplane under penalty of federal law? No. No such law exists because there is no federal statute on the books. What they will point to is some delegations of authority that give the President of the United States, some combination of the President and the Centers for Disease Control, to issue executive orders designed to contain certain illnesses. And then those executive orders can be issued and can penalize people for violating them. If we truly were following the Constitution, we would recognize that that is not a federal law because it imposes new legal obligations on the American public with financial ramifications and with penalties if they don't obey. As such, they really need to be passed into law by Congress. Now, I'm not advising you to try to wear get onto an airplane without one because you probably will be punished. And you could fight that in court and you'd probably end up losing. It's because Congress has relinquished its legislative authority in this area. But you ought to ask your lawmakers. Anytime somebody's running for federal office, whether president for a seat in Congress or a seat in the Senate, you really ought to ask them about the mask mandate. It'll tell you a lot about how they view federal power and how they view separation of powers.
Yes. I am going to quote the Constitution next time I am tased for not wearing a face mask. Let's jump ahead to Article 1, Section 7, and the concept of origination, which is one of your passions.
Yeah. Article 1, Section 7 provides the formula for how you make laws. Article 1, Section 1 says that all legislative powers are vested in Congress. It's Article 1, Section 7 that prescribes the formula for how you make a federal law. It says first that in order to pass a federal law, you have to have passage of a legislative proposal, the same legislative proposal, the same words, in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. After they've passed both houses, it's got to be submitted to the President for signature or veto or acquiescence. If the President vetoes it, it doesn't become law unless 2/3 of both houses choose to override that. The origination clause portion of Article 1, Section 7 says that although it doesn't matter in which order you pass most other bills, it can pass first in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. It really doesn't matter, except if you're dealing with revenue bills, meaning bills to raise taxes. If you're doing that, it has to originate in the House of Representatives. This was a compromise reached by the Founding Fathers because they felt it was essential to put an added restriction on anything raising taxes, because the House of Representatives is the chamber within Congress most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. Every single member of the House is up for re-election every 2 years. And so they wanted to make sure if they're going to raise taxes, they've got to be on the cutting edge of that, and they need to not use the Senate as a crutch.
So applying that to, say, Obamacare, how on earth was that constitutional?
Look, Obamacare was not constitutional in more ways than I can even count. It violated the spirit, if not also the letter, of a number of different constitutional provisions. But one of the many questionable features of Obamacare from a constitutional standpoint was that Obamacare did, in fact, raise taxes. And in fact, it was through those taxes that the Supreme Court ultimately deemed the individual mandate to be a proper exercise of Congress's power, because the Supreme Court concluded it was beyond Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce to tell people what kind of health insurance they had to buy under penalty of federal law. But the Supreme Court upheld it as an exercise of the taxing power. And yet the tax provisions didn't originate in the House of Representatives. In fact, the entire proposal started in the Senate. It's just that they opened it up through a legislative vehicle that had itself previously passed the House under a different title that itself imposed some kinds of taxes, something dealing with veterans issues. They stripped and replaced that with language from the Senate. One could read Article 1, Section 7 as allowing that simply because it was an amendment to a House-passed bill. But if you look at the spirit of it, it was a cheap move. It was a move that really circumvented the spirit of the origination clause because it was raising taxes, and it should have originated as a measure raising these kinds of taxes in the House, which it did not. But this is a great example. This dispute involving Obamacare and the origination clause is one of many examples that I can point to as reasons why you shouldn't look at the Constitution as something that's under the unique custody and ultimate control of the judiciary, of the Supreme Court, because it's not. The reason is there are myriad ways in which someone can violate the Constitution that won't ever be redressed by the courts. The courts don't have authority to address every constitutional wrong. In other cases, they choose not to because it's difficult for them to discern this proper balance between the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House. So they stay out of a lot of that stuff. It makes it all the more important for us as citizens to read the Constitution ourselves and to incorporate the Constitution into our national political debates. Because otherwise, there are a bunch of these things that will never get redressed by the Supreme Court, because most of them simply won't.
So as I recall, you took Chief Justice Roberts to task on this very subject, and that's sort of in the rogues gallery of really bad Supreme Court decisions. Does anything particular come to mind as one of the most odious corruptions of the original document?
Well, yeah, as far as Supreme Court rulings?
Yeah.
Can I talk about that one for a minute?
Yeah,
I haven't,
please.
Yeah, so, I was really mad. I've been watching Supreme Court.
This is him being mad, by the way.
I think I said all the worst words in the book the day that was decided, and for me that means dang, heck, and flip. I was really mad. I've been watching Supreme Court arguments for fun since I was about 10 years old. I know it's a weird hobby, but I like it. I went day after day. The Supreme Court arguments in the Obamacare case took the better part of a week. And I went in there day after day watching the arguments. So I showed up the day that I believed that they were likely to announce the ruling. I was very upset about it because what Chief Justice Roberts did in that case was wrong. Completely separate and apart from the origination clause issue that I mentioned a minute ago. What he did in that case was to rewrite Obamacare, not just once, but twice. He rewrote the plain text enacted by Congress in order to save it from an otherwise inevitable finding of unconstitutionality. He rewrote the penalty provisions of the individual mandate as a tax, which they were not. They were a penalty. There's jurisprudence that covers this. This was a penalty, not a tax. Then he rewrote it again to create a carve-out, an opt-out for states that didn't want to expand their Medicaid programs. That carve-out wasn't in there. Congress could have provided for that. It didn't. He knew that this, too, would have resulted in an otherwise inevitable finding of unconstitutionality, and he rewrote that provision, too. Some people, to their everlasting shame, praised Chief Justice Roberts for doing this, suggesting that this was an act of brilliance to save the independence of the judiciary. Nonsense. It is not the job of the Supreme Court to clean up for Congress's screw-ups. Talking about South Dakota v. Dole? Yeah. It's a good principle. The federal lawmakers can't commandeer the state administrative or legislative machinery in order to carry out a federal objective. And so he relied on that precedent, but then circumvented it by saying, I am creating this carve-out, this opt-out for the state, which he didn't have the power to do.
So, being good libertarians, you already started where I was going to go quite soon. We're going to open this up to questions in just a second here, and I believe there's people on the sides with microphones. I have one more question, so think about what you might want to ask, and we got a good almost 20 minutes to have that conversation. I want to jump to Article 1, Section 8, and ask you the question, who gets to declare war?
Congress. Only Congress. Only Congress, by dictate of Clause 11 of Article 1, Section 8. This was a marked departure from the way things had worked under our previous national government, the one based in London. Under that system of government, the executive, the monarch, had the sole prerogative of declaring a state of war. It was then up to Parliament, the legislative branch, to figure out how to pay for it. As Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist Number 69, this was a deliberate decision on the part of the founders to throw off the form of government we had previously had and to make it different. Because we knew here that, in fact, these endless wars that were so costly, they really are probably the biggest single reason why we don't fly the Union Jack today. The king got us involved in too many wars. To pay for those wars, he subjected us to all these taxes and all these regulations and sent to us these swarms of regulators to eat out our substance and make us less free. That's why we overthrew the bastards, because they did all that bad stuff. That's why we don't fly the Union Jack today. And so founding fathers, when it came time to write the Constitution, said we're not going to do it that way. It's only the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals that will have the opportunity to put U.S. blood and treasure on the line. War is the ultimate gateway drug to big government and to tyranny of all sorts. Sometimes it's necessary, tragic, but necessary. And that's why you've got to have a power in there. But they wanted to entrust it only with that branch of government most accountable to the people. That's why it's so tragic that over the last 60, 70 years, we've been allowing presidents to get us involved in wars without congressional assent. The result has been to make us less free. And the result is inexcusable. It's one of the reasons why I teamed up with Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy, liberal Democrats with whom I don't agree with on everything, let's just put it that way, to introduce legislation to end that practice that would require us to bring about an end of funding of any military exercise ordered by a president after 20 days unless Congress has declared war or authorized force.
Okay, it looks like we're gathering with the microphone over there, and we have a question.
Yes, I was really moved by your invocation of the real estate developers in Florida who were jailed by the EPA, and your invocation of there was no malum in se there. And I think that happens way too often in this country, and I think that's a direct relation to what you just referred to, the regulators that eat out our substance. Only it's not being sent by a foreign government, it's being sent by our own government to various citizens who are not attempting in any way to actually break a law and having their lives ruined and jailed because of it. I think you're the only legislator in Washington that actually sees that as a problem. But that's not what my question is about. My question is a simple and direct one. This is a presentation on the Constitution. Do you feel the Fourth Amendment is a dead letter?
It's not dead letter. It's under stress, and we've had the limits of it being pushed. It's being ignored in some contexts, particularly in the area of domestic surveillance of U.S. persons on U.S. soil by our intelligence gathering agencies. I think that's where it's meeting its greatest threat right now, is in that area. For the most part, in other areas, we're at least going through the motions of where we need to be on it, in the sense that if there are police officers who are coming to search your home, they've got to show up with a warrant, and if not, you can generally stop them from doing that, and there will be serious ramifications for them to do it. But as you know, the government's ability to collect information is now no longer limited to what they can find in your home or in your car or on your person. Often it can be found online, and that's where it's under great threat. So it's not that I wouldn't say that it's been rendered dead letter, but it is under threat, and we run the risk that if we forfeit this grounds, given that most of our personal effects, our private communications, are now in the cloud, we run the risk of it becoming dead letter unless we push back on their ability to gain access to this information. That's why we ought to be very suspicious of and push back hard against civil asset forfeiture programs and government surveillance programs through our intelligence gathering agencies that use online mechanisms and administrative subpoenas in order to circumvent the Fourth Amendment warrant requirement.
Next question. Oh, there's guys over here too.
Yeah, I got an impression from the news media, and I was wondering how correct it is. For instance, when the Obama administration came into office, they reduced the size of the military budget and spent that money otherwise. And then when Trump and the Republicans came into office, they claimed they had a depleted military, and to refund the military back to a, quote, reasonable level, the Democrats refused to go along unless the Republicans also funded their programs, thus the deficit, or the very large deficit. So when the Democrats are in office, they cut the military, spend it on social programs, and then when the Republicans get in and restore the military funding, they have to put more money in the social programs again. Just wondering how true that is.
So it's a slight oversimplification, but you're onto something there. You're definitely right that Republicans tend to be willing to vote for more spending than they should, as long as they can justify it by saying the troops need it, the Pentagon needs it, and they need it because they told us they need it. And when we do that and don't insist on pushing back on other federal spending that shouldn't be occurring, as if it had an equivalent position of legitimacy within the federal government, that's how we lose. And that is how we've lost over and over again. That's why I sometimes call defense spending the gateway drug for big deficit spending on the Republican side of the aisle.
Just a reminder, John Roberts has never come clean about his connections with Epstein. Could be why Obama got his way on that one. But I wanted to say something, a bigger problem than even that. In September 2019, the global financial system failed through an arcane reverse repo rate. It's arcane part of the plumbing of banks. Suffice to say, that was like a financial heart attack. The Fed had to print money overnight like it was 2008 all over again. That was September 2019. November 2019, 40% of the people in my office got sick. Fast forward 1 month later, we got COVID. Maybe they're connected, maybe they're not, but I guess my main question is, that rate failed and the banks started printing and they haven't stopped. I feel the dollar's dead. Is anybody talking about that in Congress? Are they talking about embracing Bitcoin, sound money, or turning that whole system around? Or are we just along for this ride? Or am I crazy about the dollar being dead?
Yeah. There's no question that bad things happen when we just print more money. And that's become a favorite parlor trick of Congresses and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination, is to just print more money. We dress it up a little bit by claiming that we're just borrowing it, and while technically true, it has the same effect as just printing more money. Every time we print more money, the money that hardworking Americans earn becomes less powerful. It buys less. And so when we just print more money, as we've been doing recklessly, especially in the last year and a half, but even leading up to that, I mean, we spent $6.6 trillion last year while bringing in only about $3 trillion. We're on track this year to possibly spend or authorize the spending of around $10 trillion. People are starting to feel that already, even though a lot of this hasn't been spent. Some of it hasn't even been authorized yet. They're starting to feel that. They're paying more for everything from ground beef to diapers to real estate to milk to gasoline. What this really ends up doing, it ends up being like a lot of things, including like regulatory largesse. It ends up being a subsidy for the wealthy and the well-connected. Look, wealthy people can figure out a way to earn money when we print more. Poor people don't have other options like that. And so this is literally robbing from the poor to give to the rich, and it has to end. It will not end until we stop viewing the federal government as the Swiss Army knife for all that ails us, until we stop looking at government generally as a panacea for all that ails us, and instead it's just force. That's all it is. It's just force. So, anytime one of your friends talks about this or that government program that we need to implement, ask them this question: why do you want to use violence to bring about that end? That's what government is.
Thank you, Senator. We hear a lot about the 1619 project these days, and I'd be interested in your views in a couple of aspects. Number one, the project sometimes cites our founding documents as evidence of inherent racism in America. And secondly, what you see as the role of the federal government in imposing that project as a curriculum in our public schools.
Great question. Let me ask them and answer them in reverse order. As to the second question, the federal government has no role in it. Should never do it. It shouldn't be involved in any sort of curriculum development. It has no role. And yet, because it takes money from you and prints even more than it takes, and then doles it back out to the states, it does have some ability to impact it, even though it shouldn't. As far as the substance of the 1619 curriculum and of a critical race theory generally, I find it abhorrent, repugnant, and repellent in every way. Look, we are not a racist country. We've made mistakes as a country, mistakes that, unlike many countries, we've sought to overcome, and in many ways we have. It does no good to focus on racial division, to propel it, to perpetuate it. That only divides us. This is the same thing, albeit in different ways, that the Democratic Party has been doing for a long time. Remember, it's the Democratic Party that brought you Jim Crow. They sought to divide the nation on racial grounds. They're doing it again today through things like the 1619 Project. You can't let them get away with that. We are a country because we recognize who we are. We recognize the inherent dignity of the immortal human soul. And sure, there are people who harbor horrible beliefs, and they shouldn't do that. That's not who we are as a country, and that is not the same as saying that we are systemically racist, because we are not. It does no good to focus on that. It only makes things worse.
Senator, right next to the power to declare war is the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal.
My favorite
Three-part
power.
question. First, what are they? Second, how have they been used in the past, if at all? And third, could those have been used perhaps to get Osama bin Laden in a much easier way, or other types of enemies, non-state enemies of the country?
Yeah.
Thank you.
First of all, this is why I love coming to FreedomFest. You just made my day, week, month, and year by asking about letters of marque and reprisal. Only at FreedomFest would you get that question, which highlights my favorite power of Congress. A letter of marque and reprisal, for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's fantastic. It's basically a hall pass issued by Congress that allows the person holding it to engage in state-sponsored acts of piracy on the high seas with impunity in the name of the United States of America. To be a pirate. How cool is that? Privateers. So it was used, it's been used in a number of conflicts, including the Barbary pirates. And it's a way of taking care of our enemies without necessarily expanding the role of the state and the cost to the citizenry to that degree. Yeah, I suspect we could have done that with respect to Osama bin Laden, and I think it's a power that's far too seldom used. We ought to use it more as an alternative. You know, I hope not to have to use powers like that very often, but when we do, we should consider that an option.
From a constitutional viewpoint or in general, could you give your views on presidential executive orders?
Yeah. Not all executive orders are created equal. They're not inherently bad in and of themselves. Let me give you some examples of where they can be lawful and constitutional. Where a president is acting pursuant to an authority granted him either by the Constitution itself or by a duly enacted statute passed into law by Congress. The president is acting in an Article II capacity, meaning in an executive role that's been given to him. Let's suppose, for example, that the president issues an executive order ordering flags at military installations and on our ships to be flown at half-staff for one reason or another. He is, in fact, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has abundant authority to do that, even without a separate statutory grant of authority. At the opposite end, you have presidents sometimes acting in the absence of such a thing. Some of those executive orders are constitutionally suspect. For example, if hypothetically a president were to try to rewrite our immigration laws in order effectively to grant amnesty, in the absence of any provision in the text of the statute at issue or in the Constitution giving him that power, then that is a bad executive order. Sometimes people have been defenders of executive power, have sometimes been quick to point out that, Republican presidents in modern history have either granted more executive orders than Democrats or nearly as many or roughly a comparable number. Nonsense. It has nothing to do with the volume of executive orders, because not all of them are bad. It has to do with how they use them and whether they're venturing into legislative territory. And yes, a whole lot of them are bad. A whole lot of them violate the twin structural protections of the Constitution, where the federal government's acting where it shouldn't act, and if the federal government's going to act, it needs to be through Congress and not the presidency, and those are repugnant. There's a great synopsis of this. Justice Robert Jackson wrote a concurring opinion in a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer. This is also known as the steel sheet seizure case. If you're curious, sometime look that up online, and you'll see his analysis of how you figure out which executive orders are good and which are defensible.
Okay, we have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. We have 2 questions left. We probably only have time for these 2. Let's try to get through them.
I'll be fast.
Senator Lee, I'm interested in the bounds of executive power. If we had somebody like, let's say yourself, who happened to be in the presidential chair, how far could you push the envelope as president? For example, previous presidents before 1974 used to impound funds. Would you be able to impound funds, for example, that you thought was an unconstitutional spending? What authority would you have? There's very limited authority in the U.S. Senate and House as one person. What could you do in the role of a president?
All right, so if you're talking about executive power generally, there's a fair amount that a president can do, first and foremost by exercising the power inherent in the veto pen. And I think that's a power that's been too infrequently utilized by modern presidents. They haven't threatened to veto stuff that arrogates too much power to the federal government or to the executive branch. I would certainly do that. I would hope that any liberty-loving modern-day president would wield the threat of the veto pen that way, in a way that hasn't been utilized for a long time. With respect to not spending funds granted by Congress, it depends on the funds in question and how they were obligated statutorily. There's a wide range in how much flexibility they have on that. Generally speaking, they can't pretend as if a certain appropriation wasn't made by Congress. But depending on which area you're talking about and which legislative vehicle authorized the spending, they may have some flexibility.
Okay, we are sort of out of time, but I am going to shamelessly plug the series starring Senator Mike Lee, The Constitution Line by Line. It is co-produced by Free the People and the Federalist Society. Those guys are pretty good too, and I want to give them a shout out. And please, your homework for tonight, or tomorrow if you're going to be out partying tonight, is go to freethepeople.org, check it out. It's an ongoing series, and the more eyeballs, share it with your friends, share it with your kids, your grandkids. This is how we sort of get everybody to understand that the framework of liberty in the Constitution is the only way to protect us against tyranny. Give it up for Senator Mike Lee.